Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. We are with the Indigenous Primary Healthcare Council, and today we're just going to be sharing some traditional Indigenous health and wellness practices within an integrated healthcare model. So I am here today with my coworker, Mandy Mack. I will give her a chance to introduce herself. My name is Dakota Reckley. I'm the director of our Indigenous Cultural Safety Program here at IPHCC. So I support all of our education and training as well as resource development as it relates to Indigenous cultural safety. And I'll pass it over to Mandy really quickly for a quick introduction.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dakota. Wachie. Good morning. My name is Mandy Mack. My family originally comes from Attawapiskat First Nation, and I'm the Traditional Healing and Wellness Manager for the Indigenous Primary Healthcare Council. So happy to be here. Miigwech.
Thanks, Mandy. So a little bit about the IPHCC before we get started. We are an Indigenous governed and culture-based organization. We were established to support the advancement and evolution of Indigenous primary healthcare service provisions and planning in Ontario through partnerships, education, and advocacy. We use Indigenous solutions to transform Indigenous health outcomes and decolonize health systems by empowering voices of Indigenous people and communities, partnering with Indigenous communities, mainstream healthcare organizations, and government agencies, gathering and sharing data about the health status of Indigenous people, as well as equipping our council members with the tools, training, and networks to provide quality healthcare. So we are a member-based organization made up of Indigenous primary healthcare organizations across Ontario, which include Indigenous community health centers, Aboriginal health access centers, family health teams, nurse practitioner-led clinics, as well as Indigenous interprofessional primary care teams. For today's presentation, we are going to focus on some historical and contemporary experiences for Indigenous people in Canada and how this relates to the importance of traditional healing and wellness practices. Any presentation that IPHCC does always includes history and context of the impacts on Indigenous people in Canada, because it is important to continuously build awareness in order to provide safe and equitable care for Indigenous peoples and communities. The first part of our presentation over the next few slides is going to cover some topics that you may have already heard or be aware of, but it is good to have these refreshers. This information is also important to be aware of as it does correlate with the importance of and significance of traditional healing. It's important to recognize the harm that has been done, as well as the importance of building trust and understanding how to apply the knowledge you may have learned. This can all correlate to social prescribing because while this is not a term often used by Indigenous communities and organizations, it is a concept and practice that Indigenous people have been practicing for time immemorial as it relates to their health and wellness. During this presentation, we won't refer much to the term social prescribing, but we are going to explore how traditional healing approaches within the second part of this presentation and how it's important to understand and recognize that Indigenous primary healthcare organizations continue to practice this concept of social prescribing within their healthcare delivery. It includes access to various community programming, as well as access to Indigenous traditional healing programs. Today's presentation may cover some traumatic or triggering material for individuals, and we recognize the need for safety and creating safe spaces. We want everyone to be able to take care of themselves, and if you need to step away for a moment, that is okay. So we're going to start with some history. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its report, Honoring the Truth, Reconciliation for the Future, which identified 94 calls to action aimed at addressing the legacy of residential schools and advancing process of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. Some of these calls to action relate specifically to traditional healing practices and healthcare, notably to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of Indigenous people. And there were also 10 principles of reconciliation provided, notably number 4 and number 9, which speak to the perspectives of elders and knowledge keepers and integrating these knowledge systems. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Canadian government implemented policies through the Indian Act, such as residential schools, Indian hospitals, and child welfare interventions, which aimed to assimilate Indigenous peoples and strip them of their culture and traditions. Implementation of these policies, along with others, had long-lasting effects on Indigenous people and communities' mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. At the time of Confederation, Canada's Indian Act was created with the intention of obtaining Indian lands for immigration and settlement, while protecting the Indians themselves by creating Indian reserves where they could live. The intent was to civilize Indians by encouraging Christian missionary work and then enfranchise them by granting them the same civil and political rights that other British subjects in Canada possessed. There were many stipulations contained within the Indian Act that impacted Indian status. For example, if a First Nation woman married a non-First Nation man, then they would lose their status, and their children would also not be considered legal Indians. These women were able to regain their status in 1985 with an amendment to the Indian Act. A major reason for these types of legislations that impacted status was to limit the federal government's financial responsibility by limiting the number of people with Indian status. The Indian Act was ultimately a vehicle for implementing policies to civilize, protect, and assimilate First Nations people. And we just want to share this quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who once said, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian questions and no Indian department." So we're going to cover the residential school system next, which was the most well-known assimilation policy implemented through the Indian Act, and impacts from the residential school system continue to impact Indigenous people's health and wellness today. Through the Indian education period, it originally began with missionization and an attempt on the part of Christian missionaries to convert Indigenous populations to Christianity. This era eventually developed into the day schools and Indian residential schools for almost 150 years. The first residential school opened in 1831 in Brantford, and attendance was made mandatory in 1920, even after it was reported that children were dying at alarming rates. It was reported that at the time of the 1940s, Indigenous children were more likely to die attending residential schools than Canadians fighting in World War II. The last residential school closed in 1997 in Nunavut after over 100 years of neglect, abuse, and physical and emotional harm of Indigenous children. I'm going to touch on Canada's history of experimentations, as this is important and continues to be a reason for Indigenous people's mistrust towards the healthcare system and other institutions. Nutrition experiments were performed by the Department of Indian Affairs on over 1,000 children in 6 residential schools across the country from 1942 to 1952. The parents of children were not informed of these experiments and consent was not obtained. In these experiments, control and treatment groups of malnourished children were denied adequate nutrition. The intent was to test an experimental fortified flour mixture on residential school students, and at the time there was a federal ban on this flour. These researchers found increased incidences of anemia among the children who were fed the experimental flour, contributing to more deaths and impacting their development. Even as children were dying, these types of experiments continued with efforts made to control as many factors as possible. We're going to share a story from a residential school survivor because it is important to hear the voices from those who have attended these institutions. Again, this may be triggering for some, so please be kind to yourself as you're watching this video. It may be difficult to hear.
The residential school system took away my language, my culture, and my identity. Yeah. I'm a residential school survivor from the Cree community of Moose Factory, Ontario. My mom and dad were hunters and trappers, and we survived off the land. Cree was spoken around the house, was pretty much it. And I went to residential school. I went to residential school when I was 7 years old. The Department of Indian Affairs had a policy, and every child had to attend residential school. So my parents would go to jail if I didn't go to school. And I attended Bishop Horton Hall Indian Residential School, and I also went to Shinwalk Hall Residential School in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Residential school survivors were harshly disciplined. What happened to me was I was physically abused by a supervisor. We were told not to pass food around in the dining room to other students, and I got caught passing the slice of bread, and I was severely punished by the supervisor. I don't think all the survivors or the supervisors, staff, teachers were bad. This was a barbecue. They were having a barbecue this is my hockey team. That was when we won the championship in the winter of 1963. So they treated us with hot dogs and hamburgers and marshmallows, and we had a great time. I became an alcoholic around 20 years of age. Yeah. Many survivors use alcohol, or Native people use alcohol or substances as a coping mechanism to block your emotions and feelings. People are left with a sense of belonging. You want to find your sense of belonging and identity. First, I had to sober up. I've been sober for 25 years. So I went back to my traditions, my culture, and that's where I found my identity. Well, I think the non-Indigenous people or Canadians need to become allies, settler allies with First Nations, Indigenous people, and learn about the history of the true history of Canada. Yeah.
So another historical incident is the 60s scoop, where the apprehension of Indigenous children into child protection services escalated. The 60s scoop saw large-scale removal or scooping of Indigenous children and lasted for decades, with most removals taking place in the 1960s, hence the name 60s scoop. At this time, it was common practice for social workers to take almost all newly born children on reserves from their mothers. This was a result of amendments that were made to the Indian Act, which gave provinces jurisdiction over the Indigenous child protection, which guaranteed federal funding for every Indigenous child that was apprehended or taken from their family. This resulted in a ballooning of the number of children taken into care and made legal wards of the state from 1% in 1959 to 40% in the 1960s. The child welfare period includes the 60s scoop and the current day millennial scoop, and this shows how the child welfare system continues to operate as a tool to further assimilate and displace Indigenous children from their families. This systemic removal of children continues today, with as many as 52% of Indigenous children being raised outside their families, cultures, and their nations. Indigenous children are still overrepresented in the child protection system. 8% of Indigenous children aged 14 and younger are in foster care, compared to 0.2% of non-Indigenous children. In Manitoba, it's reported that 10,000 out of the 11,000 children in care are Indigenous. Being in care for Indigenous children has also shown to have significant negative outcomes. In BC, studies have shown that children in care are 4 times more likely to die than other children the same age, with suicide, homicide, and infectious disease being the leading causes of death. The Indian Hospital, which is a period that ran parallel to the Indian education period, it saw the government opening more than 22 hospitals, surpassing 2,200 beds, and most of them were located in Ontario and Western Canada. These hospitals originally opened to isolate tuberculosis amongst Indigenous populations and to test new vaccines and drugs for tuberculosis, but ultimately functioned as racially segregated hospitals where Indigenous patients were provided substandard care. Indian hospitals ultimately became places of harm, experimentation, and death for thousands of Indigenous children as well as adults. They explain the deep-seated fear that Indigenous people continue to have within the healthcare system in Canada. I'm not actually going to share this video because we will likely run out of time. But if anyone has some time later on, I do encourage you to look for this video on YouTube. It is of a Métis elder who recounts the traumatic events he experienced as a patient at the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital in Edmonton. He was taken from his community to receive treatment for tuberculosis at 7 years old, and he remained in the hospital for 2.5 years. Some more contemporary experiences for Indigenous people include birth alerts, which is a practice where social workers flag an expectant parent to the hospital staff without their consent because they feel the parent may put their newborn at risk. The hospital then notifies the social worker when that baby is born, and this practice sometimes results in child apprehension. A birth alert starts with the assumption that a parent cannot care for their child and that the child is safest when separated from its parent. And this practice disproportionately impacts Indigenous women as a result of assumptions and stereotypes about Indigenous women and the unconscious bias many people hold towards the Indigenous population. Indigenous families can be targeted for this practice for several reasons, such as being in care themselves, policing, and criminalization of poverty. Indigenous families represent 30% of birth alerts that are issued. The impact of this practice on Indigenous women is harmful for a number of reasons. The fear of having a birth alert issued can deter women from seeking prenatal care and further create sense of medical mistrust for the health system and those that work within it. Birth alerts ended in BC and Ontario in 2020. However, the practice is still widely implemented in some other provinces across the country. We're also going to touch on forced or coerced sterilization of Indigenous women, which has gained a bit more recognition over the last few years. The Sexual Sterilization Act was passed in Alberta in 1928 and British Columbia in 1933, and this made it legal to sterilize women who were deemed mentally incompetent. A forced sterilization is one performed without the woman's consent, and international human rights law has clearly established that forced sterilization violates multiple human rights and is an act of gender-based violence. The federal government was using sterilization as a form of birth control in First Nation communities, and a documented 580 sterilizations took place at 2 federal hospitals with Ontario. Consent for sterilization was received in only 17% of those cases. The last reported case of forced sterilization among Indigenous women occurred in 2017. So some of the symptoms of the ongoing suffering and experiences by Indigenous people include homelessness, substance use, and elevated suicide rates. These are resulting from colonial institutions and policies such as residential schools and the 60s scoop. The medical mistrust that is felt towards the healthcare system is a result of the racism that Indigenous people experience when accessing care. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have reported being ignored, belittled, mocked, disrespected, and discriminated against by a healthcare practitioner in the mainstream healthcare system. These attitudes and behaviors are very harmful and can cause delayed treatment or outright denial of care. And this results in substandard care, negligence, and worsened health conditions, even sometimes death for Indigenous clients. In order to best support Indigenous people in health systems, it is important to know the journey that they have been through. Racism and colonization are intertwined and together deeply impact the health of Indigenous people in Canada. Systemic trauma and racism underlines every aspect of an Indigenous person's life, and if we want to see different outcomes, we have to be willing to try to do our work differently. The goal of trauma-informed care is to support people to make decisions about their healthcare and treatment needs in ways that feel safe to them while avoiding the possibility of their re-traumatization. Promoting and delivering compassionate, informed treatments and services in a culturally safe way is essential to improving access to services, as well as raising the standard of care for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Hospitals and doctors' offices can feel unsafe for someone who has experienced this trauma. As providers, you can create safe and comfortable environments for people when we actively recognize, acknowledge, and understand that this trauma can be present. So all of the information that we have presented today has heightened your cultural awareness and has led to this piece about the significance and importance of traditional healing and wellness practices for Indigenous peoples and communities. One harmful aspect of Canada's colonial history is the implementation of harmful policies that banned individuals and communities from conducting traditional practices, such as ceremonies that have been used as a form of traditional healing. Because Indigenous people have been practicing traditional healing and wellness for so long, the inability to undertake healing practices has led to further traumatization for many Indigenous peoples. With that being said, Indigenous people are resilient, and many have begun the journey to healing themselves and their communities by practicing and reconnecting to their culture. There has been an uprise of people taking their pain and turning this into action, and for many individuals, families, and communities, healing can be found within culture, ceremony, and approaches to wellness. Culture is an important part of healing for Indigenous people for many reasons. It is a fundamental part of Indigenous people's identity, and the restoration of cultural practices and traditions can help to heal the trauma caused by the loss of cultural identity that has resulted from colonization and other traumatic experiences. Cultural practices and traditions often bring people together and provide a sense of belonging and connection to their community. This can be especially important for those who have experienced trauma, as it helps to build resilience and support systems. Many Indigenous cultures have a deep spiritual component, and cultural practices and traditions can provide a sense of meaning and purpose. This can be important for those who experience trauma as well, because it can restore a sense of hope and healing. And finally, many Indigenous cultures have a holistic approach to health, which recognizes interconnectedness of the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects of a person. And this approach to healthcare can be very effective for those who have experienced trauma, as it can help to address the root causes of trauma and promote healing in a comprehensive and integrated way. And for the next part of our presentation, I'm going to hand it over to Mandy.
So hello again, Chimigwech Dakota, for providing a great overview of some of the historical, impacts to the health that Indigenous people have today. So we're going to discuss approaches to traditional healing. So another way practitioners can support Indigenous clients is becoming familiar with traditional healing and models of holistic care. As Indigenous people, we continue to honor our ways of knowing and being, and recognize it's important to care for one's whole being rather than treating a symptom. It is also equally important to respect and become aware of alternative health views. And this especially applies to health professionals who work with members of diverse cultural backgrounds. But we shouldn't assume every member of a given cultural group shares the same views, the same protocols, or even the same experiences. Instead of relying on assumptions about cultural representations of health, an alternative would be to have health professionals engage in conversation with the client and exchange their views of health. Discussing alternative forms of treatment and sharing one-on-ones leads to better care and will help determine what kind of approach would best suit or support the client's needs, as determined by the client. Next slide, please. Mine's not working. Sorry, just 1 second. So we're going to get into description roles of elders and knowledge keepers, because there is a difference between both. So who is the Indigenous knowledge keeper? Knowledge keepers have been identified by their respective communities as having physical, emotional, intellectual, and/or spiritual gifts. They hold a position in the community that is recognized and respected, and are frequently considered role models for other community members. And they have a specialized and valued set of knowledge, values, experience, and skills, and this may include traditional healing and the use of traditional medicines. So what role do knowledge keepers play in healthcare setting? While the role of knowledge keepers really do vary, some of the roles they carry, let me just adjust this, can play in healthcare settings include opening, closing meetings with a prayer or song, smudging and leading ceremonies. They can lead workshops, seminars, panels, or talks. They can preside over conferences. At IPHCC, we usually use our elders and knowledge keepers that lead us in a good way during meetings. Knowledge keepers can provide mentorship meditation, and or guidance. They can also sit on committees and boards and provide consultations when needed, and they may also provide advice and support to those who are in need of it. Indigenous people within corrections may have limited access to traditional healing supports and services. These supports are often important for individuals' healing journeys. So learning about traditional healing and what it can look like is one way to support clients' health and well-being. Next slide, please. So traditional healing practices may emphasize communication with spirit beings. This may include tobacco or medicine offerings and are direct requests for healing. Communication within the spirit becomes communication with the spirit beings occurs through prayer, song, and ceremony, and these practices are adaptable to the unique needs and balances of the patient. Healing is attained by achieving balance and harmony across relationships, and healers often call upon the medicine circle to illustrate what balance might look like to those who are seeking care. It must be noted that there are many forms of traditional healing across Indigenous cultures, also because not all Indigenous people have been raised by their culture. They don't always know what the protocols for healing are within their own form of traditional healing. Next slide, please. So some forms of traditional healing may include land-based models of care, water-based models of care, natural land navigation techniques, offering of traditional ceremonies and rites of passages, crafts and importance and significance, traditional medicines, oral teachings and storytelling, traditional dancing and regalia making, traditional singing, spiritual gatherings, community and cultural celebrations, traditional hunting and gathering approaches, and learning about traditional food systems. Next slide, please. So some of our core values within the Anishinaabe culture are the 7 sacred values. You may also know them as the 7 grandfather teachings. So they can be useful in stepping or to creating a wise practice framework for medical professionals to embed in their own work. These values may differ slightly across Canada, but the intent is much the same: to think and reflect and choose before you speak or act. The wise practices journey through the 7 grandfather teachings or values begins with understanding and embracing the significance the following values can play in anyone's life. So we're going to start with the first value, which is courage: to speak, to reveal, to reach out, to be open, to be introspective. The next value is honesty: to know yourself and your own values, biases, and beliefs, to speak from the heart and soul, to allow yourself to truly be seen and known. The third one is humility. We are all in this together, and we all have inherent value. No one person is greater than any other in spirit. The fourth is respect. Coming together and honoring place and space, knowing that this is something you must give to get. Honoring everyone from the youngest to the oldest. So respecting everyone's place and space. The next one is truth. Our truth is not the only truth. There are many paths to home. We are created equal no matter how much we learn. There is much we do not know. Love, unconditional acceptance of self and other, accepting and embracing differences, allowing and gracefully being giving of everything we are. And the last one is wisdom, providing an expansive and inclusive view of the world. These teachings and stages are not inclusive or final, and each one has something that enhances and illustrates the others. In order to understand the underlying principles of wise practices, it is important to understand how these values guide people throughout their lives, how they can be expressed as tools for change, where they might impact community values today, and how they can potentially transform unhealthy practices in care. Next slide, please. So the two-eyed seeing approach, some of you might be familiar with this teaching. So Atukdamik, two-eyed seeing, refers to learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of the Western knowledge and ways of knowing, and learning to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. So this teaching came from Mi'kmaq elder, Elder Albert. He indicates the two-eyed seeing is the gift of multiple perspectives treasured by many Indigenous people. We believe it is the requisite guiding principle for new consciousness needed to enable integrative science work as well as other integrative or transcultural or transdisciplinary or collaborative work. So IPHCC is currently working on developing a micro-credentialing e-learning course that fosters awareness about traditional healing, how it can be complementary to primary healthcare models, and the scope of traditional healing. And then finally, how healthcare practitioners can work with Indigenous healing practitioners. You will learn about some of the success stories from our leading Aboriginal health access centers who have been providing integrated traditional healing for the last 20 plus years. And so where they've already successfully integrated traditional healers, working alongside with Western primary healthcare practitioners. And one example of that is Anishinaabe Health Toronto has a FASD diagnostic clinic where the traditional healer is also part of the diagnostic team. So the diagnostic team consists of traditional healer, psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a family doctor, and together they work on diagnosing a child with potential FASD. So that's an example of how traditional healing can be complementary to primary health care. And the traditional healer provides advice, support, and guidance on medicines and different land-based programming or ceremonies that could be helpful to the client or patient who is living with FASD. Next slide, please. So another teaching that we value is the Hawk and Wolf teachings. The Hawk reminds us to take a wider view so that we can see everything. This is very important when we look at clinical relationships. Clinicians must consider everything in the life of a patient. As such, they must look beyond the four walls of a clinical setting to truly be effective in patient-provider relationships. This includes having a fundamental understanding of the history of colonialism in healthcare and how it impacts the current day of health behaviors and outcomes of Indigenous peoples and populations. So the Hawk teaching, it's an Indigenous teaching. We believe that the hawk and the eagle are the closest relative that we have to our creator. It brings our prayers, it brings our tobacco. We offer tobacco, and it brings that spirit of prayer to creator. The hawk can see everything. It reminds us to take a wider perspective, a wider view of things. It has the gifts of just perspective and having a wider perspective on life, on everything around us. So that is why the hawk and the eagle are so valuable to Indigenous people. For clinical teachings, we use it to take a wider view. Clinicians must consider everything in the life of the patient, look out of the four walls that they're in to be effective in a clinical relationship, understand the history of colonialism and how it impacts the health outcomes of Indigenous peoples and populations, and open up to new knowledge systems and view them as gifts rather than something that is preventative. The next slide is the hawk or continuing with the wolf teachings. So the wolf is a spirit animal or totem, also has several attributes that can inform work in healthcare. The teachings of humility is taught to us by the wolf, and while all we need is humility to collaborate effectively. So the teachings around the wolf is they teach us about overcoming failure. They are tenacious, they are good citizens, and work out squabbles amongst themselves. They navigate their position in the community with humility. They listen and communicate carefully, and family is everything. We also believe that the wolf also is the one that takes care of its community members the most and adopts those members within the community that may not be associated with a clan or a pack. So some of the other teachings that our clinicians can learn from this is that there will be challenges in clinical relationships and sometimes result in failure. The key is to learn from our mistakes, to be good citizens. You are a guest in communities. Be humble in your clinical relationships. Listen and learn to communicate carefully. Include family in the clinical plan if that is possible. Next slide, please. So applying the model of holistic healthcare and well-being. Meeting Indigenous people halfway in the inclusion of their values, stories, and treatment options will make a difference in places where access to care is limited. Similarly, this applies where there's a large Indigenous population who may benefit from the inclusion of elders and healers, where mainstream practitioners typically dominate the space. A different kind of patient-centered approach where elders, traditional healers, and family are considered in the circle of care is what we are envisioning through this work. The Indigenous Primary Healthcare Council has developed a model of holistic health and well-being, which states the following. We are committed to providing the best healthcare to our clients, our communities, and our people. The commitment is guided by our Indigenous values, our ancestry, and our teachings of our grandfathers. The care provided will be inclusive and determined by the patients, clients, families, and communities we serve. We will be guided by our connection to the land, the plants, animals, and grounded in the idea that food is medicine. We will communicate in the language of our patient or client's choice. Next slide, please. So the prioritizing cultural as medicine. The individual and group experiences of Indigenous peoples are influenced by multiple socio-cultural factors. When experiences are negative, practitioners may see the patients rejecting their approach to healthcare. The adverse impact that has on health outcomes may be exacerbated by the fact that several individuals may be living in remote settings with little choice in the practitioners they have available to them. In order to prioritize cultural as medicine, you can offer the use of traditional practices within your healthcare models and make these options accessible, offer patients different treatment options and support the selection of their choice, ensure care pathways are mapped out and connected to Indigenous communities, create opportunities to co-design models of care with Indigenous communities, establish an Indigenous advisory committee and solicit their input regularly, accept that there are illnesses that other models of health may interpret as mental illnesses, that Indigenous healers may identify as emotional or spiritual. Next slide, please. So here are some strategies you can put into place to integrate traditional healing approaches to your practice. To initiate the process of inclusion, invite elders, traditional healers, and knowledge keepers into your space of learning. Learn about the healing capabilities of plants and sacred medicine and acknowledge their potential value in community healthcare. You can start by learning from elders, traditional healers, and knowledge keepers about medicines, how they may be used, and where to find them. Host workshops to reflect on the contrasts and connections between the Indigenous and Western determinants of health. Foster an environment where it's okay to ask questions. Practice humility, cultural safety. Learning is lifelong and ongoing. It's okay if you don't know something. Next slide, please. So we're going to share a video. And Dakota, are you able to? This video is one of our elders that works on our web, one of our Indigenous primary healthcare organizations. Her name is Gloria McGregor, and she's a traditional healer with Shkaba McQuay Healthcare Center that's located in Sudbury. So miigwech.
Mental health. Traditional mental health supports. Contemporary mental health supports. Contempo traditional. What I need to be whole. Call it what you will. It doesn't change what it is. a part of my whole interconnected with, inextricable from, emotional health, spiritual health, physical health. Living a good life, Minnow Bimadzuin.
All right, miigwech everyone for joining and listening today. As I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, we won't refer much to social prescribing as Indigenous organizations and communities. However, it is a very vital concept that we have been using for quite some time. And you can see it reflected in many of the traditional healing practices and approaches that we take to healthcare, and ensuring that it's integrated in our models of care and service delivery. So that concludes our presentation today, and we can open it up for some questions.
Thank you very much, Dakota and Mandy, for an excellent presentation. I do have a couple of questions on the chat, and I'll start with this first one. How can non-Indigenous individuals learn to respectfully engage with and support land-based healing without appropriating or disrespecting traditions?
I would say for non-Indigenous individuals, regardless if you're in healthcare or not, I think the best step is really to look at meaningful engagement with communities and organizations. And I would encourage you to reach out to us at IPHCC, because we do have many resources available that speak to some of those wise practices, that speak to what that meaningful engagement and relationship building is. And the best step to take is to just ask patients and clients what their needs are, what they want to see in their service delivery, and then always reaching out to whether you have Indigenous healthcare organizations, friendship centers, or other similar organizations, community-based programs that may offer some of those services. Reaching out to look at how you can collaborate to ensure that you have like the best possible care for those patients and clients. So when it comes to integrating any sort of land-based programming, then you wouldn't be appropriating those services, because you'd be building relationships with Indigenous people themselves that can support that service delivery.
Thank you. Are there any initiatives or organizations dedicated to preserving and promoting traditional land-based healing practices that you would like to either talk about or recommend?
So there are many across the province and even across Canada. And I would say one of our largest organizations that's across Canada are Native Friendship Centers across the board. And so they do a lot of work with revitalizing our cultural knowledge and ways of being and our languages. And so I always, when people ask us this question, is how can we learn more? How can we become better allies? Or how can we connect with folks within the Indigenous community? I always say start by volunteering at your local friendship center or the health center. A lot of urban spaces have, Indigenous primary healthcare organizations that are led by Indigenous people. And so that is the best way to connect, to see if you can do some volunteer work or, and that's the best way to contribute to the community and also learn about the community. So I'd encourage that, for each and every one of you, now that you know about the history, the trauma, the ongoing I call action work that needs to happen. I think that's one ways that, we are Canadian citizens and all could be stronger allies.
Anne asked, first of all, Anne said, thank you so much for the presentation. Anne says that she's interested in finding out about different Indigenous health and well-being models. And is the Indigenous health promotion model that was presented at the 2000 Health Promotion Summer School, it seems very familiar. Did you incorporate the Indigenous health promotion approach in developing this model?
I can't speak to the model that would have been presented at the promotion summer school. I don't know what that model looked like. However, IPHCC's model of holistic health and well-being actually wasn't developed directly from IPHCC. So the Aboriginal Health Access Centres in Ontario, which have been around for 25 years now, are the ones that developed this model. And IPHCC actually evolved from the work of the Aboriginal Health Access Centres. So this model has been around for quite some time and has been used amongst our Aboriginal Health Access Centres, and now through promotion through IPHCC, because we did evolve and we incorporated because of the work that the Aboriginal Health Access Centres have been doing for quite some time. So IPHCC itself can't take whole ownership of this model, but it's a model developed through our membership that we also now promote and engage with through the work that we do.
Yeah, I also have to say and add to that it's a universal model that's like, stems from, prior to contact, prior to colonialism. We've always believed as Indigenous people that there's the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical component to one's, well-being. So, I mean, these are not just something that, was created. This is something that we've always believed in and followed for centuries. Yeah. And it's a worldview. It's not just, specific to this turtle island that we call Canada, but around the world, there's holistic views on taking care of a whole person.
Brilliant. Thank you. That was a good segue. There's a question. Is there an IPHCC type of organization in Manitoba?
I don't know. I actually, honestly, I can't answer that question. Much of our work is guided by our membership here in Ontario. I don't know, Mandy, if you might be aware of any through some of the work that you've been doing with traditional healing.
Yeah, there's the First Nations Health Authority, which is a Canadian body, which actually talks a lot about to the traditional healing and wellness, and they have conferences, and they put on information in their websites as well. So there's a lot of organizations that practice the model of holistic healthcare, and with a traditional lens. So definitely, but in the meantime, you're welcome to reach out to us. We are also a part of Team Primary Care, which is a national initiative funded by the federal government. And so we already work with partners that are across Canada and do webinars like this to talk about holistic healthcare models.
Mandy, we have one final question, and this question is from Gary, who asks, it often feels like we're putting a huge burden on Indigenous people and communities in our area by asking for consultation and input on our programs, knowing that there are many health institutions and teams asking for the same. Can you recommend ways or spaces in which to safely consult without adding burden by creating new structures or groups?
I would recommend, we do have many resources available, and the presentation today was really just a very small glimpse into a lot of the work that IPHCC does. But it is a great question. We do get this a lot. And one thing that I would just really emphasize is to ensure that you're including Indigenous communities and organizations at the onset, at the beginning. Far too often, Indigenous communities feel like they're an afterthought, and organizations come to them after there's work already invested, and then they feel like they are not being included when it really matters the most. And ensuring that you're giving something in return, right? If you're going to Indigenous communities or organizations for support and consultation, taking a step back and really looking at that two-eyed seeing approach and how it's going to benefit everyone involved in the work. But really, I think if you're approaching communities in a good way with good intent, and you're looking at that from meaningful engagement and respectful relationship building, and you're not just approaching communities with what they can provide you, but you're looking at that relationship as a whole, many of them will be receptive to having those conversations. But again, if you're unsure, definitely take a look at some of the resources and training that we do have available. And IPHCC really does support in some of those relationships and really building that awareness and education on how you can approach those. So every community is different. There's not like a one size fits all answer to how best to approach them, but if you're doing it in a good way, they will be receptive to it.
And we do actually have time for one more question, and we have one more question. The question is, it feels so intuitive. Thank you so much. What's something that brings you each joy and meaning?
I can go first. I thank you for that. And that's really nice to have something like that asked, because in our work, and I know Mandy can probably speak to it too, we do often have to have very difficult conversations, and presentations such as these are not always the easiest to do, with our own, personal histories that we may have to face as Indigenous people. But for myself, I have 5 children who are very busy with sports and school and all these other things in our life. And it makes the work that I have to do, it adds that extra value to it, knowing that I'm doing what I can to make sure that there's good and safe spaces for them, and that they'll grow up hopefully in a much better place than some of ourselves and our families had to. So yeah. Mandy.
Yeah, miigwech, Maria, for asking that question. I really, we don't often get that question at all. But yeah, essentially the work that, the Traditional Healing and Wellness team does is laying the foundation for a stronger, healthier community for the next 7 generations. And that's what brings me most joy, is thinking about 7 generations from now, knowing that we've done everything humanly possible to regain and restore and start practicing our Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And like Dakota, I myself have a brood of kids. Mine are the number 6, but just feeling good that I can look my children at the at the end of the day in the eyes, and know that I've done my best every day to ensure that there's a brighter future for them and the next 6 generations after them. So miigwech.
Thank you to Dakota and Mandy. And folks, that brings us to the end of this concurrent session. We've put a number of links on the chat. If you hopefully you've copied those or reached out and got them into your browser. And we will see you in the next concurrent session. Thank you so much for your engagement and for asking some very wonderful questions. And thanks again to Mandy and Dakota.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.